The next generation of gaming is going to look a lot different than today. Let's see how Apple plays into this. What's up everybody, Brad here, and we're doing a deep dive into all of the next generation gaming services. And if you haven't checked out the other videos, you can find them in the description below. But we're talking all the major players, Sony, Nintendo, Apple, Google, Amazon, and to see how they are going to take a little bit of slice of that market share for the next generation of gaming. And on this edition, we're going to take a look at Apple. And while you might not think Apple is going to be a big player, I think they are. And granted, I don't necessarily think they're going to be targeting, say, Sony or Microsoft, but Nintendo is definitely going to need to be paying attention to what the folks in Cupertino are up to. And so what we do is we're rating them on all of these companies on cloud technology, fan base, intellectual property, or also known as IP, services, and hardware. So let's just dive in here. Now, when you think of Apple, you don't typically think of cloud, but they very much do have a cloud service. More importantly, Apple understands how to grow and scale services in the cloud. While they may not have all the hardware, they definitely do have cloud servers, but they also utilize things like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft at their disposal. And more importantly, Apple has a ton of cash, over $200 billion in the bank. So if they needed to, build out their cloud infrastructure, they could absolutely do that further, but they already have enough data centers to make this possible. Now, I don't necessarily think they're going to get into the game streaming wars like Microsoft and Sony and Google and a couple others might, but they're definitely going to be a player in the next generation of gaming. I mean, and to some extent they already are. But for the cloud rating for Apple, I'm going to give them a solid B. Now, they're obviously not going to be as good as Amazon. They're not going to be as good as Microsoft. I think they're going to be at least comparable, if not potentially better than Google, possibly. There's a lot of things that factor into Google, and we'll talk about that when we do the Google episode. But they understand how to scale. They use a mixture of their own platforms and third-party services. And so they have a cloud infrastructure in place, and they already know how to move data at scale, which is very, very important. So I'm giving them a solid B. Now, fan base for Apple is very interesting. They don't have, in the gaming world, the traditional gaming kind of people like I'm Team Xbox, I'm Team Sony, that type of thing. But people who buy iPhones and buy Apple hardware are typically very, very loyal to the company. We've seen people line up for Apple hardware outside the stores for days on end and other crazy stuff. The question is, will that translate over to their gaming service called Apple Arcade, which they announced? We'll talk about more here in a second. That's a really good question, and it very well might. If nothing else, Apple has over 1 billion iOS devices that they can funnel towards that. And obviously, they're going to keep selling millions of iPhones and iPads going forward. So, do they have the strongest fan base in the world? I wouldn't say nearly as good as something like Sony, but they definitely have very high loyalty among their users. So again, I'm going to give them a B. They definitely have room for improvement because they can't prove yet that that's going to translate well over to their new services model that they've been rolling out. But at the same time, they've already proven that people love Apple hardware and they're going to keep buying it, which means it's going to come preloaded on that hardware, which they sell in a volume of millions of devices a month, which granted, they outsell traditional consoles and everything else by a factor of 10 on an annual basis. So yeah, they've got a good fan base, but the problem with Apple is, much like Amazon, they don't have a lot of intellectual property. Now, is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? Granted, Apple is going to be competing, I think, mostly in the mobile segment. Now, I put a caveat there because it's also going to work on Apple TVs and iPads and everything else, but I think it's mostly those more mobile-ish type games, more snackable content as it's often referred to as, rather than these deep dive adventures that you see on platforms like Microsoft's Xbox and Sony's PlayStation, or even on the PC for that matter. So for an intellectual property, I give them a C. Mostly because they don't own any of the content. They're just picking the best of the breed on mobile and they're putting it into their arcade service. Which, speaking of services, this is the big one for Apple because they announced earlier this month Apple Arcade, which is going to be for an undetermined amount of money per month. You're going to be able to play a bunch of different mobile games. It actually sounds kind of decent. If you spend a lot of money on mobile games, because they already said there's going to be no in-ads, there's going to be no in-app purchases, so you're just going to pay a fee, get a whole bunch of games, potentially. We don't know the quality or the breadth of everything that you're going to get. but it's going to be all bundled into arcade. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, I don't necessarily think Apple is going to be taking on the likes of Microsoft and Sony. If you want that type of a gaming experience, you're going to go buy one of those consoles and you're going to be really happy with it. I think the biggest threat for the next generation is probably Nintendo. Nintendo has got to be scared mindless of Apple because, again, Nintendo is a little bit more of a casual gamer. I wouldn't say they're the hardcore, but they definitely have a strong fan base. Don't get me wrong, but Apple has the ability to attract that same audience. They already have tons of hardware out there. And so I think Apple and Nintendo are going to be competing more closely than, say, an Apple to a Microsoft or Sony, which is why Nintendo's got to be really on their game for the next generation of hardware, because if they're not, Apple could very much come in and just swoop it up. It would be super interesting if Apple just, say, bought Nintendo. They've got the cash to do it, to get those first-party titles that Apple so desperately needs to get people into those platforms and services. It'll be interesting to watch. I give Apple a C on the services because they don't have... It's very much unproven if Apple Arcade is going to do anything. They have a game center on the iOS devices, but it's garbage. And so they're going to get a solid C on that. And candidly, that might even be generous. Now, on the hardware side, I think this one's pretty easy to point out. Apple makes really good hardware. People tend to love it, minus the keyboards on the new MacBooks. People really like iPhones and iPads and Apple TVs. They sell pretty well. Apple has a very, very broad reach with this. And so you got to give them a B. You really do. It's not as good for, in a gaming aspect, it's not as good as, say, a traditional dedicated console like a Sony PlayStation or, again, a Microsoft Xbox. But at the same time, they have such broad reach into so many consumer lives already. And the hardware, people, again, line up for it. They do a really good job on it. The question will be, can they turn something like a pane of glass into a good gaming device? Well, you could probably make the argument that it already is because, again, games are among the top selling things in the App Store. The question is, will they be able to suck away any of that Nintendo money or that gaming money from the larger players in the gaming segment like Microsoft and Sony? That's up for debate. But I think Apple is going to be an interesting player to watch because they're going all in on the services model with a TV subscription service, a news subscription service, and this gaming subscription service, which means that Apple is a player in the next-gen gaming segment, although it's going to be here probably this fall is when they're saying it's going to launch, unless it's like AirPower that never does, although I think this one absolutely will launch. So this has just been a look at Apple. I think you can't really rule them out of the next gen or gaming segment. I think it'd be foolish to do that. But at the same time, they're not competing for the same console dollars, at least not yet. Not yet. And I think that not yet is key because I could imagine that if Apple gets some serious momentum in their arcade monthly service, they're going to go much deeper into the gaming segment. And if they do, they will be a serious threat because they have so much money at the same time. And don't forget, at one point, Apple did build a console that was a generation ago, a couple generations ago, and I don't think that they are going to go back down that road, at least anytime soon. But they do have the Apple TV, which is a very capable device, the 4K model, already in homes today, which they could very easily turn into a console-like gaming experience with a dedicated controller. So this has been an analysis of Apple. We'll have many more to come. You can find, again, that stuff in the comments and in the descriptions, if I could say descriptions. So with that, guys, this has been a look at Apple for the next generation of gaming. Have a good one.